So welcome to Parachute's webinar on the Dementia-Inclusive Choices for Exercise, or DICE Toolkit. My name is Stephanie Cowle, Director of Knowledge Translation at Parachute, Canada's national charity dedicated to preventing serious and fatal injuries. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which Parachute's offices are located. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, the Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, this land is still a home to many Indigenous peoples, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We are meeting today on a virtual platform, which gives us all the opportunity to reflect on the lands we live and work on. And I encourage you all to take the time to learn about the history and present and future of the land you live, work, and play on. Today, myself, I'm located in Thornhill, just outside of Toronto, and I sit on land that is central to the Toronto Purchase. And since time immemorial, this land has given food, medicines, and water, all essential elements to community and health. Before we get into today's presentation and I introduce Dr. Laura Middleton, I'd like to start us off with a few key items of information for you. First, please note that this webinar is being recorded. We will send the link to the recording to everyone who registered. We will have time for questions at the end of the webinar. At any point during the session, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask your question. We will also have folks monitoring the chat if you have any technical issues and need assistance. At the end of the webinar, as you are leaving, you will be prompted to complete a short evaluation of just a few questions. And your feedback is really valuable for us. It helps guide future learning opportunities. It helps us understand how effective these events are and what they add to your life and to your practice. So please do take a moment to complete that evaluation. We really appreciate it. And this webinar is made possible with funding support from the Public Health Agency of Canada through the Healthy Aging program. And one last plug is I do want to mention that we have another webinar on a related topic focused on best practice exercise interventions, which will happen on April 22nd, 2026. And we'll put a link in the chat in case you're interested in also joining us for that session. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Laura Middleton. Dr. Middleton is the Schlegel Research Chair in Dementia and Active Aging at the University of Waterloo and Schlegel-UW Research Institute for Aging. Dr. Middleton's research aims to identify strategies to promote well-being and independence of those living with or at risk for dementia. She focuses on the role of physical activity and complementary lifestyle strategies. She involves people living with dementia, care partners, healthcare professionals, and community service providers as co-researchers to create accessible and effective supports and interventions. She is also the co-lead of the Canadian Dementia Learning and Resource Network. Welcome, Dr. Middleton. Thank you so much. Really looking forward to your presentation and invite you to pop your slides up and kick it off for us today.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the introduction, and to everyone here for taking time out of your day to attend this session. It's always a pleasure to speak to people who are enthusiastic in this space and are really thinking about how to better support people living with dementia in their communities. As Stephanie introduced, my work aims to both reduce risk for dementia, but also, and what I'm focusing on here is promoting the well-being of people living with dementia. Now, I expect that most of you know, given that you're here, but I'll just start by defining dementia. So dementia is a set of symptoms. It's not one condition. It's a set of symptoms where people experience cognitive changes that are sufficient to impair their activities of daily living. So dementia can be caused by Alzheimer's disease, but also by other things like vascular disease in the brain, frontotemporal dementias, and other types of dementia. People living with dementia experience diverse physical, emotional, and sensory changes that affect their ability to participate in exercise, but also their fall risk, as is relevant here. Like many of you, I'll come to this space with some personal experiences and professional experiences related to dementia. So personally, I came into this work when my aunt was diagnosed with young onset dementia at the age of 46. It had tremendous impact on our family, including my cousins who were only 12, 14, and 16 at the time of my aunt's diagnosis. This really has spurred my work initially to reduce risk of dementia, but later realizing that, people could live with dementia so much better if they had better supports. In the context here, I'm the principal investigator for the Dementia-Inclusive Choices for Exercise project. But I think it's important to highlight that I'm only one member of our DICE team, as we refer to it. This was run as a participatory action research project in that we involve many different interested parties in this work. When we started this work a number of years ago now, we thought it was really important to bring these diverse perspectives around the table so that we could make something that was relevant to the problems people faced in practice and then could be implemented feasibly. So we included these diverse perspectives in all phases of the project, including setting project objectives, processes, and knowledge mobilization and evaluation. Our team, as is shown in this in these photos, and it's actually expanded from there, includes researchers, two people living with dementia, a family care partner, exercise providers, including clinical exercise professionals and kinesiologists, dementia service providers, and healthcare professionals, including physicians. Additional people in these roles were engaged at different points in the process, whether in consultation with an advisory team of people living with dementia or in workshops that set, really in motion the development of the DICE toolkit, which I'll discuss later. We reflected on each person's experiences and perspectives to increase the likelihood of creating resources that will have impact and be adopted. So here I just provided a high-level overview of our session and of our process, our DICE project process. With an aim to improve the well-being of people living with dementia through physical activity, we aligned our project processes and the session here on what is called the knowledge to action cycle. The idea behind that cycle is that you're identifying a problem, understanding the research out there, and creating opportunities for it to be implemented in practice. At the top right, you can see a really simplified version of the knowledge to action cycle. Over this session, I'll talk about the rationale for our project, the problem that we were trying to solve, and the barriers to physical activity among people living with dementia. Next, I'll provide an overview about how we used participatory processes and co-design to select and tailor our DICE toolkit, which includes both training and resources. Finally, I'll talk about the tools that we developed and how they may be useful to you, as well as evidence for their effectiveness in an evaluation amongst exercise providers. Now, I will say up front that I'm not going to go all the way through the DICE training, but I'll provide a sneak preview. And the good news is that you can access all the DICE resources and the training modules for free online at that website that I showed on the first slide, www.dementiaexercise.com. So first, starting about the rationale. So I'll start with the current status and experience of people living with dementia in Canada. This was outlined within Canada's National Dementia Strategy that was launched in 2019. Within the strategy, they outline the current status in several areas as well as the aspiration or goal that we're working towards. Right now, it takes many years for many people to get a diagnosis of dementia. And once they do, they are often given relatively little support from the physician or the healthcare system. They may be given one of the 4 approved drugs for Alzheimer's disease in Canada. Well, the new drugs recently approved in the US offers some hope for pharmaceutical management. We're a long way away from reasonable implementation in Canada, and these drugs also come with substantial risks. People diagnosed with dementia are often told immediately to start planning for their end of life when they'll lose function and communication. They may have their driver's license taken away immediately, and at best, they may be referred to the Alzheimer's Society for care and counseling. And even though many of these conversations and steps are really important, it's not enough. It's not enough for the people living with dementia who deserve the same care, rehabilitation, counseling, and support that we give people with cardiovascular disease or a cancer diagnosis. As a result, the aspiration of Canada's dementia strategy is to provide a timely diagnosis in a compassionate manner with immediate availability of resources and supports. I admit that I like the words of Roger Marple better. Roger was a friend, an Albertan, a person living with dementia who was a tireless advocate for change. He had worked for years in the Alberta health system and so brought his personal lived experience of dementia alongside that healthcare system expertise. He passed away a few years ago, but his words continue to inspire me and focus my research. To an audience of people living with dementia and family members, he said, "What if we started with hope? The learning process for dementia needs to include hope for living well and practical ways to achieve this. This should be taught first." And so, what can we give people living with dementia to support them to live as well as possible? The answers likely differ depending on who you talk to. But I would say, and several guidelines for the management of dementia agree, that one of the supports we should provide people living with dementia is accessible, evidence-based exercise programs and opportunities for physical activity. Now, I would argue, actually, that access to exercise and physical activity is a right enshrined by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability that ensures equal access to habilitation and rehabilitation for all persons with disability, including persons living with dementia. More recently, Canada's Accessible Canada Act supports the implementation and these rights of people in Canada. So, what's included in this mandate for habilitation rehabilitation? Those include strategies to attain and maintain maximum independence, physical, mental, and social ability, and full inclusion and participation. They say that measures should be available early after diagnosis, close to home, and should support participation and inclusion in activities in their community. To ensure these supports are available, professionals working in habilitation and rehabilitation need to be trained to engage with and meet the needs of persons with disability, again, including persons living with dementia. And so, why should exercise be considered an essential part of habilitation and rehabilitation? Most simply, there is strong evidence that exercise improves functional abilities of people living with dementia. The mechanisms by which it improves functional ability are probably multiple. Exercise improves strength, fitness of people living with dementia as it does other individuals. People living with dementia who take up exercise have better balance and mobility. They also experience improved cognitive abilities and reduced fall risk. I will point out that people living with dementia who take up exercise have reduced falls and fall risk, regardless of whether they're early on in the disease or they're living in long-term care. All of these benefits help to contribute to ongoing independence of a person living with dementia at any stage along their journey. I do think it's important to highlight the broad benefits of exercise in any context, though. I've found that when I talk to people living with dementia, they often talk about the social and mental benefits of exercise first. The importance of these benefits should not be minimized. When people living with dementia talk about physical activity and exercise, they often mention the social engagement and support, companionship, and sense of community created within exercise, physical activity, or sports programs. Their confidence and mental well-being can improve through gains made with exercise. And this confidence can carry over into everyday life. I think having an opportunity to improve and succeed is especially important in the context of a progressive illness. So if people living with dementia are going to experience the benefits of exercise and physical activity, there are two critical challenges. First, at last measure, only about 20% of people living with dementia in Canada were regularly physically active. So how can we change this? There are also relatively few dementia-specific exercise programs that are available. Day programs are often focused on gentle movement rather than the moderate intensity physical activity recommended. The Alzheimer's Society Minds in Motion program has been a great success. Well, it can be beneficial to many people with dementia. The challenge is a single program cannot be enough to meet the diverse needs and preferences of people living with dementia. So the first step, if we're going to try to change behavior, get more people living with dementia to be active, is to understand the barriers and facilitators that contribute to the problem. For this purpose, as part of the DICE project, we conducted interviews and focus groups across urban, rural, and northern settings, mostly in southern Ontario and northern BC. In these interviews, we specifically asked about different types of barriers and facilitators to physical activity and exercise. And in line with what we call a socio-ecological model, we probed issues both at the individual level, but also among relationships, especially with the care partner, and community or societal issues. This slide summarizes some of the important barriers integrated with prior research that we already knew about. The issues bolded in black are more novel findings of our work. And the issues of red are things that were particularly prominent in northern or rural communities. Of course, physical and cognitive abilities, along with motivation of people living with dementia, can create barriers to physical activity. This isn't surprising. Importantly, though, the physical health and abilities of the care partners are also important. Care partners are often key supporters of physical activity. So if they are experiencing physical health issues, including poor balance and mobility, it also restricts the ability of people living with dementia to participate. Accessibility is a major issue, not just of transportation or available facilities, but of programs and exercise professionals who can meet the needs and preferences of people living with dementia or mild cognitive impairment. Many of our participants perceive these as rare or unavailable in their communities. This is particularly the case in northern or rural communities where having and retaining exercise professionals was challenging in and of itself. Stigma and fear of stigma also dissuades participation in programs and providers. If programs and providers support inclusion and encourage participation, can then motivate participation, especially if there's positive support among their peers in the program. That positive support in the program of exercise providers and peers can be seen as a critical facilitator to physical activity. Persons with dementia described wanting programs that not only met their needs, but also aligned with their preferences. So, not only a group program, but also sports or individual supports that aligned with their preferences and their identity. So, having programs that were aligned with their age or their gender were also important. One woman with dementia in particular described identifying with women care partners more than the men living with dementia who were in programs. And we also considered these barriers in the context of what we heard from exercise providers. Specifically, exercise providers came with a variety of experiences related to dementia that informed their diverse perspectives in programming. These experiences could be positive, such as having a loving relationship with a family member with dementia, or negative, for example, if they encountered primarily people in acute care that were very stressful settings. Because of these diverse experiences, alongside a lack of standardized training, exercise providers were mostly forced to learn as they go, adapting ad hoc when they encountered problems rather than planning ahead and implementing best practices. And so we saw a clear need for accessible training and education, recognizing that practices will always have to be flexible to the individual person, setting, and needs. And so within the Dementia-Inclusive Choices for Exercise project, or the DICE project, our vision was to increase the number and quality of physical activity opportunities available to people living with dementia by training exercise providers to understand and meet the needs of people living with dementia. This, in behavior change language, can be referred to as enablement. So we're helping to overcome their barriers, their individual and setting related barriers by having people who can help them overcome those challenges. So towards this overarching vision, we brought two teams together. First, the research team, which I described earlier and is pictured here on the left. The research team provided strategic oversight for the project, integrating the input of existing research and evidence, our own research, as well as co-design processes to make decisions and about the direction of the project more broadly. We met monthly over Zoom for several years. I will note that we were meeting via Zoom with people living with dementia even before the pandemic. Decisions on targeted questions were made through reflection and discussion within the research team. To design tools, we also convened the research team as well as additional people living with dementia, care partners, exercise providers, and other community partners in a focused workshop. You can see some photos here from that workshop to provide a framework for tool development. We confirmed and expanded the key knowledge that we thought should be translated and how that knowledge would be packaged into tools. This included a series of individual, small group, and large group activities to focus and prioritize the tools to develop. When needed, we also engaged a representative from the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology who helped align our work with their own trainings. And we also, in addition, we engaged an advisory of people living with dementia and care partners when we needed more diverse lived experience perspectives. And so this is where we got through for our participatory co-design project. We plan to have multimedia training modules that include videos, text, and case studies. The training modules should help to understand the variability of people living with dementia and their abilities and experiences, how to adapt delivery of exercise and the environment to their needs, as well as how to support uptake and adherence to exercise. We propose to have a series of motivational videos that aligned with similar themes, understanding the variability of dementia, that exercise can be fun, meaningful, and beneficial, and that everyone across the dementia journey can participate and benefit. as well as a video focused on how exercise providers can support participation and success. We developed a passport to exercise, which made it easier for people living with dementia to convey their unique abilities, preferences, and goals for physical activity. And finally, the co-design participants thought it was really important to have a resource directly for people living with dementia to show the benefits of exercise, a variety of options for physical activity and exercise, and advice for how to get started. So following this workshop, we started the iterative design of the tool. We first met with the research team to come to consensus on the path forward, and then worked with designers and the team to create our tools. We made additional changes after usability testing among exercise providers and people living with dementia. And then we conducted an implementation and evaluation study that I'll talk about a little later on. But first, I'll give a brief review of the tools that are available to you online. So all our tools created from the DICE co-design process are now housed on a website. You can get directly to the project site through www.dementiaexercise.com. Is also embedded in a larger website that's focused more broadly on dementia wellness. And the address for that larger website is www.dementiawellness.com. The training modules and associated resources I'll discuss a little bit further, but can be found under their respective tabs on the DICE project website. So probably the biggest focus of the development was on the DICE training modules, which includes 5 different lessons. The first focuses on understanding dementia and the diversity of dementia in terms of age, changes, and abilities. This includes a review of different changes that people living with dementia may experience, as well as discussion of the different types or causes of dementia. We talk about the rights of people living with dementia in relation to exercise, and this has been really important in terms of convincing exercise providers that planning for inclusion is important. We introduce core dementia-inclusive principles that would apply to almost any setting, such as design of facilities, dementia-friendly communication, and thinking about the full continuity of supports required for participation of a person living with dementia. The last 2 modules are focused directly on physical activity and exercise, the first outlining the benefits of physical activity for people living with dementia, and the second discussing core principles of dementia-inclusive exercise. And this includes what we call a menu of supports and strategies that may be useful depending on your practice, your program, and the needs of your participants. This is just a screenshot of what one of the training modules looks like. You'll see content topics displayed on the side and the content displayed in the middle. Buttons mark how to move about the training modules and mark it as complete. At the end of the 5 lessons, you receive a DICE completion certificate, which I now see more and more often in applicants to jobs related to dementia. The videos that we were produced regarding dementia were, I would say, highly impactful for both exercise providers and people living with dementia. The videos are both embedded in the learning modules, but are also included as standalone resources. And I think hearing from people living with dementia and understanding their interests and abilities has been really important in terms of the learning of people moving through the modules. And so I will take a couple minutes here just to quickly show a shortened version of one of our videos. This one is entitled "Staying Active Helps Me Live Well with Dementia."
And I didn't think I could, use most of the equipment because I've never been an exercise person other than for walking, but I love it.
Some of the benefits that people living with dementia experience with exercise would be improved mood, improved independence, just the ability to feel better day to day.
I feel more energetic, and I think I sleep better, and I just, exercise is totally doing me good, 100%.
I had a lady who used a walker every day after our exercise program. She does not bring that walker with her anywhere. She doesn't need it in the house. She walks independently, and I can only imagine how much independence that has given her.
And when you feel more confident, I think just in exercise, I feel like that translates outside of the building as well. So hopefully they feel more confident in some other skills, maybe conversing with people, because it is in an environment where you need to connect with others. And then there's a group class, so there's other participants and other caregivers. So that's a really important aspect of that benefit, that they feel, I think, positive about their physical ability, but then also their ability to still interact with people around them.
So it's sort of like, oh, gee, life isn't going to be as bad as I thought.
I do like to highlight there that those background shots were all of exercise program that we run for people living with dementia at the University of Waterloo. And you can see people really successful there. I think it's important to note that, these people are at a variety of stages along their dementia journey as well. Clearly not the very late stages, but a number of these people would have a hard time, communicating or talking in a lot of programs, but we're still able to be quite successful in these exercise programs. So in addition to the training module for exercise providers, as well as the videos, we house a variety of resources that can be downloaded for free from our website. There are resources that are specifically for people who are supporting exercise, including, ones that will help you learn more about exercise and dementia through research reviews or dementia-friendly community documents. There are documents that you could use when working with clients and helping to understand their needs and preferences. There's resources that you can share with clients who are living with dementia or their family members to support them better. These resources can be accessed directly by people living with dementia and care partners as well, or of course, shared by providers with them. I'll just review a couple key resources. So It's Time to Get Active began as a booklet developed by a consensus panel out of the Ontario Brain Institute, which I sat on as well as another DICE team member. What we found when we were actually starting to use this document is that the original version was not seen as very dementia friendly to use. And that is our error in that we didn't have deep collaboration with people living with dementia at the time of its development. As a result, we worked with the Ontario Brain Institute to revise the format and content as part of the DICE project. The resource includes the benefits of physical activity, advice on time and types of physical activity to do, and strategies to get started, stay safe, and make it stick. So we have both a short version that's 2 pages and a longer version that's 6 pages. So if you're going to share one resource about exercise, it's a great option. We also developed a resource for being active at home, and this was done a little bit spur of the moment back when the pandemic started. We knew people were losing access to supports and programs, so provided some, advice for planning at-home exercise with relatively little outside support. This may be useful for you to share with people living with dementia who are doing some of their exercise at home. Finally, I briefly mentioned the passport for people living with dementia, but we ended up referring to it as wallet cards primarily. They're small little cards, and you can see the sections that are shared here. The idea is that people can share some core information about themselves without having to recall and communicate it each time. So I know exercise providers have been quite enthusiastic about these, and the use of people living with dementia really depends on how comfortable they are talking about the dementia diagnosis. Other resources that can be found on the DICE website and maybe of interest include a lengthier intake form. So Light Life Training, Planning for I Can. It was developed in the UK, but helps understand more detail about the person living with dementia and their resources. We also have our own Canadian version that it prepares for wellness programs more broadly. There are also some sample exercise videos and handouts, research reviews, and additional resources. Again, I won't go in detail here about all the learnings from the DICE training and tools. I wouldn't have time to do that in a 45-minute session, but I'll give a little bit of a teaser. Most importantly, many of the adaptations are not fundamental to exercise. Much of the exercise guidance will align with their physical condition and abilities, their experiences, their history. A lot of the adaptations are really to do with your communication and to the environment in which you're doing exercise. Not surprising, paying close attention to people living with dementia is critical because they have often may have more difficulty communicating, more difficulty remembering exercises and technique, and more difficulty monitoring their intensity of effort closely. So you watching that through verbal and nonverbal cues can be really important. When communicating, there's several dementia-friendly communication strategies, but a couple are using short, literal instructions and breaking it down to step by step if needed. Especially when a person has communication difficulties, nonverbal communication is really important. So both paying attention to things like their facial expressions, if they have inclinations to walk away, those are not just difficult behaviors, but are communication of what's going on. So if they're trying to leave the activity, they're probably having some frustration, for example. I would say both pay attention to nonverbal communication and also use it yourself. So using nonverbal cues such as gentle touch or demonstration can be really valuable. Say planning for an inclusive environment is really important. A few of those items that might support an inclusive environment are clear signage that include images as well as words. Consider the volume and type of music. Loud beating music can be really overwhelming to a person with dementia, especially if they have more significant sensory processing challenges. Reduce clutter in the environment and be aware of mats and mirrors. So if people have any difficulty processing visual information, they may see a mirror as another person rather than just a reflection. They may see a dark mat as a hole in the floor rather than a mat that's in the way. The supports that individual people living with dementia needs are likely to vary across people, but also day to day. Their abilities and challenges can vary on what we might call good or bad days. So it's really important to be adaptable and pay attention to their needs on any given day. I think also be in this light, be patient with yourself as you try to figure out and solve challenges. And I think really importantly, don't be afraid to encourage and challenge people living with dementia. Again, exercise is a space where they can experience success and gain confidence. And this can be important to their everyday life. Now, I know leading up to this seminar, there was an email about virtual delivery. I think before the pandemic, so I'm going to discuss that just a little bit here before I finish up with our evaluation. I think before the pandemic, very few people would have thought we could deliver exercise virtually. to people living with dementia. And like many things, we were forced to adapt and accommodate because there wasn't any other option. So at this point, I've worked with the Alzheimer's Society to create virtual offerings. We've delivered our own virtual programs to people living with dementia. So I can share a few things that have been successful to us. Again, similarly, many of these are about delivery rather than the exercise itself. So to ensure safety, we do generally do one-on-one virtual assessments to test balance and uh, mobility before we start the program. Depending on the findings, we will choose either standing or sitting exercise. And we tend to be a little bit more conservative than if we were in person and could give them in-person supports. So the two core assessments that we do are, a series of stance tests to see if they can hold each stance 10 seconds, and then 5-time chair stands to get an understanding both of their lower body strength and how stable they are as they move through those chair stands. We also just have conversations to ensure that they can follow two-step, I use the word commands, but instructions, because this will make it more likely that they'll be able to follow instructions effectively and safely in an exercise program. In terms of some of the safety procedures that we use is we generally ensure that someone was in the home with them. They may or may participate in the exercise session themselves, but they're there for safety. We also have a safety script that we use every day, every session, because they may not remember some of those steps otherwise. And this includes confirming their location so that if there is an emergency, we know where to direct safety personnel. We ensure they have a phone within reach because if anything happens, then we call them, even if that's just them going off camera. We also require them to have their camera on so that we can monitor safety and we know if something's going on or if they're frustrated in the program. Will admit, as I said at the start, exercise will necessarily be a little bit more conservative in terms of intensity and complexity of exercise than in person, but it is possible. The Minds in Motion program, as well as our dementia lifestyle intervention for getting healthy together, are two examples where we've successfully delivered it virtually. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that. So I'll finish here prior to questions with just a brief discussion of our evaluation of the impact of the DICE toolkit. So we, a few years ago, we recruited a small sample of exercise providers who worked with older adults. Some of them had experience with people living with dementia and some did not. Within our intervention, exercise providers had 6 to 8 weeks to review the DICE toolkit, including the training modules. During this time, they recorded their reflections and, where possible, implemented the learnings in their practice. Now, how we evaluated the effectiveness by both a survey before and after the learning period, in which we evaluated their self-efficacy or confidence for delivering exercise to people living with dementia, their attitudes towards dementia, and their knowledge about dementia. And then we also had semi-structured interview before and after to understand their experiences, their learning, and the impact of the training. So this is just a brief summary of the characteristics of our sample. You can see that there is a variety of different designations in terms of their role with exercise, and they practiced in a number of different environments as well, anywhere from YMCAs to long-term care. So optimistically, we saw improvements in their confidence for exercise delivery. We saw improvements in their attitudes towards dementia, kind of moving from that more stigmatized view of dementia as a condition where people don't have abilities to a more positive view, and their knowledge also improved. I think probably the points that resonate the most are, of course, their quotes. So the DICE toolkit was described as valuable resources to learn, teach, and support exercise. So one person said, I will definitely use the resources or modules provided by DICE for future reference. one prime example in which this can be used is whenever I receive students for placements. I feel as though if they were to complete the DLICE modules, it will help give them a better understanding of not only what it's like to live with dementia, but also the relationship between exercise and dementia and how to implement exercise for those living with dementia. Another person said, well, it's very informational, very educating, and I like that. Like every module was something new for me to learn. I think the videos were very well done. I think they gave me more insight into what it or dementia was really like. I think those videos were really important. We really found the videos were key for changing perspectives. One person said, I love the videos. It kind of made you stop and think when you see the person living with dementia in videos explaining how they feel. The one gentleman about his partner, yes, the videos were excellent. Another person said about what they liked. I found the videos were very engaging and very well put together. It was nice to hear directly from individuals living with dementia, but also how exercise directly affects their everyday life. So in practice now, we've implemented the DICE videos in a number of different settings. Importantly, it's standard training now for the Alzheimer's Society Minds in Motion leaders, their core exercise programming. It's continuing education under the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology, the Ontario Kinesiology Association, and more. And I like to highlight that it's now one of the top 15 resources in the World Health Organization Dementia Repository, or the most highly rated in that repository, which includes high quality resources related to dementia. So just finishing off, I look forward to your questions, but we used a participatory process that really engaged diverse voices to develop a toolkit that we hope is relevant and impactful in relation to exercise and dementia. The training and resources improve knowledge and attitudes towards dementia and confidence to deliver exercise. And all of these are freely available for professional development and reference at www.dementiaexercise.com. So thank you very much for being here, listening. I want to acknowledge, of course, all my collaborators, CIHR, or the Canadian Institutes of Health Research that funded this, as well as the Alzheimer's Society of Canada and all our partner organizations. So I'm very happy to take audience questions now.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all of that information and congratulations on the work. I'm sure those evaluation results, especially from people with lived experience, people applying this information is rewarding to see. So that's wonderful. And thank you so much for starting off by sharing Roger's words with us and this idea of living well with dementia, right? Not just living, not just surviving. Such a simple adjustment of language, but such an important concept and really shows the important value and expertise that people, when they share their lived experience, how it can change initiatives and make them so much better and reframe them. And we get so much from that. Yeah, we definitely have some questions coming in. I'll start with one that's a clarifying question just related to the DICE resources. One of our participants who's seeking to access the information in French mentioned that they're able to access the modules they registered and but noticed that perhaps the manual was only available in English. Is that the current state and is there any plan to have the manual available in French?
Yeah, so I would say that the DICE module, you're right, is only available in English. We didn't at the time have money to translate. We should look into that now because I'm sure I can find money. I will say that we have a second manual called the Dream program, and that's kind of expanded the scope a little. It includes and is meant for not just exercise providers, but anyone delivering wellness programs. So it does have a lot of the content related to physical activity, also has content related to healthy eating and mealtime programs. So that is available in French and would have a lot of similar resources. So I would just direct you to the resource section and look for the Dream manual, and you should be able to access that in French there.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, it sounds if it's possible to also move the other resource into French. Sounds
Yeah,
like you have at least one taker. No, it sounds like
yeah,
there's I think this is really fitting a need, so that's wonderful.
absolutely.
Okay, let's try and get through as many questions as we can with the time remaining. First is from someone, haven't yet had a chance to go through all the DICE
Yeah,
resources, but wondering if one of the things addressed in the resources is about how people can support sort of lack of initiative or apathy or disinterest in starting activity,
yeah.
specifically with people living with dementia.
Yeah, we touch on that a little, especially in our case studies. I would say, I mean, just to give a few things that have been successful here and a few points of learning is it depends a little bit on your setting, of course. In home environments, it often requires, involving a number of different people to get them to the program in the first place. Sometimes it may be, the spouse and the children, and sometimes it's the exercise provider or the program provider who reaches out and gets it. Now, what I would find if people get to the program, we've had many people who are hesitant about being there the first couple times. And if we can convince them to continue to come, they often, change their perspectives related to exercise. Because if you can make that as a positive, successful environment, there are so few of those often as people are coping with a diagnosis that people are pretty enthusiastic to come back as well.
Hmm. Yeah, a really important point. Acknowledging that first step is the
It's
tough one.
huge.
So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So check out the information that's available on that piece. Another question about, you talked about your process of creating this very specific to experiences of people living with dementia, which of course is a very diverse group in of itself. And someone's asking about, are there learnings or tools or content in this that could be extrapolated to, potentially some other populations who are underserved, particularly who may be experiencing, neurocognitive disease, traumatic or acquired brain injury, things like that. Have you
Yeah.
found
I
that
mean,
or?
I think we often say that if you can accommodate people living with dementia who often have cognitive, physical, sensory challenges, you can accommodate many other groups. Obviously, it's most directly applicable to other people who are experiencing cognitive disorders. And I can see the question, certainly people with stroke, people with traumatic brain injury, other sources of cognitive impairment, this would certainly be relevant to. Sometimes there's difference it's in age, but a lot of the critical adaptations are communication and delivery and not exercise, dose. And so I think those are relevant to a lot of different populations for sure.
Hmm. Yeah, and just as a follow-up connection to that,
Yeah.
are there any specific considerations you would note when if people are looking at this and thinking about how to adapt it?
So I'm not sure I understand the question.
Oh, no problem. Yeah.
Sorry.
So if someone's thinking about looking at the DICE toolkit and
Yeah.
say, hey, I want to use this maybe with a different population, so
Yeah.
TBI, something like that, are there any specific
Yeah.
considerations you would encourage them to take into account when doing that?
Yeah, so I think I mean, the way we treat it is that, in terms of the adapted exercise delivery, it's a menu of strategies that are appropriate, that you select as are appropriate to the person. And so I think that menu of strategies is going to be relevant to different populations, and you just choose the appropriate ones. So I mean, I think the biggest things with TBI or stroke for that matter may be age differences. But I don't think there's a lot, so the description around dementia would be less relevant, but the strategies to support inclusion would be very similar. They may have, you may be they may have greater baseline exercise. But again, we talk about that being very dependent on their physical ability and not an essential component of exercise. So
Hmm.
I think the first chapter might be less relevant, but I think most of those additional chapters would be very, very relevant to any of those groups.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned that first step is, considering the person, considering
Yeah,
their context. So that's naturally gonna affect that.
yeah.
Wonderful. Um, okay. And someone's asking about and whether you address this in your work or not, involving residents who are nonverbal, or they also mentioned folks who have difficulty following instructions. Did you
Yeah.
come across those experiences or have any?
Absolutely. And I would say that, some of the people in that video would more or less be considered nonverbal, but were able to engage. Now, they were stronger, obviously, being able to do squats and whatnot. But we've engaged people with fairly limited communication abilities in a number of different environments. Obviously, it's easiest one-to-one, absolutely, but we've also done that in group and in virtual programming as well. I think, some of the keys are obviously, using more nonverbal communication. So, more demonstration, using simpler exercises, using if you're in person, using nonverbal cues. So whether it's a touch, with permission, of course, to guide their movement. Um, we also talk about, obviously we want them to do it with ideal technique, but allowing them to do it as long as they're safe. So
Mhm.
if you can't, especially in a bigger group environment, sometimes it's hard to give the technical feedback that you might like to give. But if they are participating and are not at risk for themselves, we encourage them to still participate. So those are some of the examples. I think also the other issue might be with nonverbal is really ensuring you're monitoring closely for safety because people may have a hard time expressing if they're in discomfort, if they're not feeling well, they may have if, they may have a hard time monitoring intensity. So just being very aware of that.
Yeah. Another question about whether any of your research was conducted in skilled nursing settings for patients with more advanced dementia.
Yeah, so we had team members that both some of the interviews included people who are working in long-term care. We also, I don't know if you remember, but it had a few interviews. So a few of the participants were in long-term care. I will say that we initially intended to design this primarily for the community. But we have worked with Schlegel, with other, villages and other homes to implement it in long-term care as well. I think a lot of the communication strategies are relevant. You just might have to use more of them. Um, in long-term care. The biggest difference for me is that in long-term care, you have to get them from their home to the program, whereas in the community, you're dealing from the time they arrive. And I think that step of, overcoming apathy and getting them to the program is a challenge and
Mhm.
helping them get from their room to the program. Um, but we've also worked recently with Caitlin MacArthur, who's a physiotherapist in Halifax, and she's developed training specific to the long-term care environment too. So I'd say between these two, depending on your setting and depending on your own expertise, that might be another set of training that's useful to you.
Mhm. Thank you so much. We are just about at time, and I want to help everyone get out of here at the time we promised. Thank you so much. I'm seeing lots of thanks in the chat. People who are saying they are excited to check out the resources and dig in. I think you've given us all lots to think about, and provided that little teaser you promised that makes us all want to learn more. But thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you everyone for joining. A reminder, please do help us out with that evaluation on your way out. Hopefully we'll see many of you at the next webinar. Otherwise, stay well and have a great day.
Excellent. Thank you
Bye.
so much, everyone, for coming.